Hi, this is Jonah, and welcome to Russian History. So we're going to start with the Kievan Rus here. Um, they are originally from Scandinavia, and they could be described as Norse. Even Viking would not be an incorrect terminology. They arrive in Eastern Europe uh, in the 8th century, and they create a state that spans from, or a series of states that spans from their native Baltic Sea uh, area, kind of, down to the Black Sea in the south. And in the south is where they really create uh, Kievan Rus, the state. Um, there aren't a whole lot of written sources about them. Um, The only written source that we have is from quite a while after they arrive and after they've already settled, and it's called the Primary Chronicle. It was founded by the Rurik dynasty, um, and Rurik consolidated the uh, principalities of the Rus. Later, Olga would convert to Christianity, and she did so by going to Constantinople. We don't know exactly why she traveled there. There's a lot of different interpretations, but we know that she did and that she converted while she was there. Later, her three grandsons would fight a civil war. Two of the three of them died, and Vladimir the First took over, and he was a Christian, and he began a Christianization of Russia, following the Orthodox Byzantine model. They had strong ties with Byzantium, and they kept the tradition of having the ruler be sort of semi-divine, almost, kind of like they have divine authority. Next up, we have the Mongol invasion. Um, it was headed by Batu Khan. He was the grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan. He invades Russia, and he ends up pretty much obliterating an already divided and fractured Kievan Rus. A lot of cities were sacked, besieged, destroyed, including Kiev, which was nearly completely destroyed. This would have a lot of consequences. This would permanently pretty much shift the seat of power for Russians from Kiev to Moscow later. Um, some of the northern Russian states survived, but they're forced into tribute and vassalage, including the later Muscovites, who will come to inherit uh, Russia. But the Mongols form the Golden Horde, and they extract that tribute from the remaining Russian principalities. The Golden Horde is kind of centered around the Black Sea coast. Um, the disunited Russian people kind of remain under the Golden Horde for about 2 centuries. They call it the Mongol yoke. And eventually, similar to the Russian infighting, Mongol infighting breaks out, and the Black Death. A lot of bad things at once happen to the Mongol state, the Golden Horde, and they begin to decline. So, next we get to Muscovy. Muscovy started as a principality that was under the Mongol yoke, and they kind of played their cards right with their overlords and became a significant power in Eastern Europe. And to the point that they actually gained Grand Duchy status with Mongol permission from the Golden Horde. Um, Ivan the First is the first to become the Grand Duke, but his descendant Ivan the Third would go on to consolidate almost all of the Russian principalities, which includes Muscovy's biggest rival at the time, Novgorod. This is one of those historical moments where you kind of have to wonder what would have happened if their rival Novgorod had been the successful one. They were a merchant republic, more democratic. So one has to wonder if, if Novgorod had won, perhaps it would have seen a more democratic, less authoritarian Russia. But anyways, the Muscovites do win. Ivan the Third would eventually end the notorious Mongol yoke. He wins at the Battle of the Ugra River. And everyone's favorite, perhaps the most well-known Muscovite, Ivan the Fourth, known as Ivan the Terrible, would go on to crown himself the Tsar and end Muscovy and create Russia. And that leads us to the Russian Tsardom. Ivan the Fourth really expanded the Russian state, both its borders and its bureaucracy. It became much more centralized around the monarch. And to this end, he would use the Oprichnina, which is a sort of proto-military police. They put down rebellions. They serve the monarch. They keep political rivals under control, and this will become really a theme of Russian history, is this type of usage of secret police, and it again lends itself to a more authoritarian state. But Ivan the Fourth was now Tsar of all of Russia, and he expanded the borders into Siberia. He did a lot for Russia. But when he died, he had recently failed a war in Livonia, and on top of that, he had also had an unstable succession, which led to a succession crisis. This would end the Rurik dynasty, and it would lead to a lot of false Dimitris claiming the throne. The false Dimitris, they're claiming to be the eldest son of Ivan the Fourth, and claiming the throne, pretending to be him. They were not, in fact, his eldest son. His eldest son had died at that point. The Poles try to take advantage of this. They kind of smell blood, and for a short time they occupy Moscow. They put a pretender on the throne, but that doesn't really work out. And instead, this guy, Michael Romanov, is elected the new Tsar. This would begin the Romanov dynasty, which would rule until the end of the Russian monarchy. The Romanovs would expand the Russian state's borders, and they would also create a schism with the old Orthodox, which created a lot of religious division in the country. And then finally, Peter the Great, he would, uh, during his reign, he would found St. Petersburg and make that the new capital. He was very fond of the West, and he toured the West and brought back a lot of those traditions with him. He wanted a navy in the Baltic. He wanted a modern army and a modern bureaucracy. He eventually names himself emperor, and by the end of his reign, Russia is now a great European power. So that brings us to Imperial Russia. Imperial Russia, by the end of Peter the Great's reign, it was a lot more Western and had a more modern military, and it was able to compete with others in its region. But upon Peter's death, a series of queens or czarinas ruled over Russia, with only occasional blips of male rulership. Catherine I ruled only briefly via a privy council, and then Anna Ivanova ruled for about 10 years, but she was unpopular, mostly because of her German customs and German advisors, who were seen as more or less outsiders to the Russian court. Elizabeth was very successful. She promoted education, like the University of Moscow. However, she did die without an heir, which meant that her nephew, Peter III, inherited the throne, but he would be very quickly overthrown by his wife, Catherine the Great. She would go on to support the Enlightenment, especially thinkers like Voltaire, but she did remain rather conservative. She supported nobility at the expense of the serfs. She refused to abolish serfdom, even though that was a Enlightenment ideal, a humanist ideal. Her son, Paul I, would rule very briefly, but he did institute a male primogeniture system, which meant that the eldest son would inherit the throne. This is what most people are used to now when they think of monarchical succession. This would mean pretty much no more queens ruling Russia. But after his brief reign, Alexander I would come to power. He would flip-flop on his policy towards Napoleon, switching sides. He would switch political positions. The Russians suffered very heavy losses against Napoleon, but they were eventually victorious. And so finally, there's Nicholas I. He was a bit of an autocrat. He would see kind of the height of autocracy. And he would use the secret police to his advantage a lot. However, his failure in the Crimean War would reveal a lot of weaknesses of Russia, especially compared to Western Europe. And now we begin to see the cracks spread in the Russian Empire. It begins to wane. Alexander II really inherited an empire that was crippled after the Crimean War. The cracks of the old school empire were beginning to show, and Alexander II kind of saw the writing on the wall. He knew it was time. He knew it was time for reform, and so he implemented several key reforms. Most importantly, uh, he freed approximately 23 million serfs via the Edict of Emancipation. But he also established the Zemstvos, which is like a local government with better representation for rural areas, trial by jury, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, though, he would be assassinated by a socialist radical group called the People's Will. They threw multiple bombs at him, uh, and he died. This is another time in Russian history where one kind of has to think about what might have happened if this czar didn't die so early, and perhaps the effects that had on his son, Alexander III, who comes to power upon his death. He was perhaps shaken by his father's assassination, and he was a staunch conservative. He would go on to roll back or weaken several of his father's reforms. For example, he increased the power of the provincial governors against or to rule over the Zemstvos. And he also instituted a policy of Russification. So minorities within the empire would be taught to learn, they would enforce Russian culture and language on these non-Russians, such as like Poles and Jews. And then finally we get to Tsar Nicholas II. He was also deeply autocratic, like his father. He attempted some reforms, like creating the Duma, which was the parliament, but he refused to give it any real power, and he repeatedly dissolved it when it opposed him. Russia's messy involvement in World War I would eventually be his undoing. So then we get to the revolution. Russia had been unprepared for World War I, but they entered anyway to protect their ally Serbia. This was disastrous for Russia. I mean, devastating casualties, extremely low morale on the battlefield and at home. And this would eventually lead to, in March of 1917 in Petrograd, which was previously St. Petersburg, what began as sort of a workers' strike took a turn for the worse when the army that was sent in to quell it turned against the Tsar. This would spark the February Revolution. They forced the Tsar to abdicate, and in his place they put a provincial government, which shared power with the Soviets. These were not yet Bolsheviks, these were Mensheviks and other, I suppose you could say, more moderate leftists. There was a lot of quick reforms like freedom of speech, and this situation was the case for a few months until the October Revolution. The provisional government was unpopular because they continued World War I. And Vladimir Lenin enters here in the October Revolution, and they overthrow the provisional government. They have a slogan of peace and bread, basically end the famine, end the war. And they establish a communist government, and they spend several years in a civil war with the whites, like the white Russians who are pro-monarchy, but the whites lose, and eventually by 1923 the Red Army is completely victorious. They now rule all of Russia. And that brings us to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was established just before the Civil War ended in 1922. It was established by Lenin, and he would be the leader. It was supposed to be a federation of Soviet republics, each with its own sort of autonomy and individual rights. But it was still highly centralized thanks to the one party state. Um, the Communist Party ruled, and the Communist Party was centered in Moscow, and many of its officials were either loyal to or outright appointed by Moscow. Um, Lenin goes on to introduce the NEP, or the New Economic Policy, which revives private businesses. It was intended to kind of help the USSR along in its transition to communism. He dies in 1924, and despite his hesitations about Stalin, Stalin quickly rises to power by using his position as the general secretary of the Communist Party. And this position, in fact, would go on to become the most powerful position in the country. He used his position to promote loyal people and expel rivals like Trotsky. By 1929, he was firmly in power. He began his 5-year plan to collectivize farms and industrialize the economy. Uh, this would come at a high human cost, super high death toll. Many died from famine, from mismanagement of farms, or they were executed or deported, especially kulaks, which were a wealthier landowning peasant class at the time. Then, on top of that, a few years later comes the Great Purge. There's a lot of um, political assassinations here via the secret police. They send a lot of people to gulags in Siberia, which could easily be a death sentence. And these were against, again, political enemies, both real and perceived. And then in 1941, the Nazi Germans invade the USSR, and this starts World War II for the Soviets. They know it as the Great Patriotic War, not World War II. They faced insanely massive, devastating casualties, but they did still win the war, and they were able to spread their influence throughout Europe afterwards, after the war, in places like Poland and Hungary. And now we get to the late Soviet Union. Uh, Stalin dies. There's a brief power struggle, but the point is, Nikita Khrushchev, comes out on top. He becomes the next general secretary, and in 1956, he gives his famous secret speech, which announces that he plans to de-Stalinize the USSR. He outright denounces the cult of personality around Stalin. He eases censorship, releases a lot of political prisoners that were imprisoned under Stalin. The gulags would never be used to that extent again that they were under Stalin. And overall, he ended a period of rule based on terror alone, though of course the KGB would remain active, and they would be still used against political opponents. He wasn't a saint. Again, he also crushed Hungarian student uprisings against the Soviet-aligned government. He would authorize the building of the Berlin Wall, prevent individuals from fleeing East Berlin and going into West Berlin. He eventually gets ousted and replaced with the guy pictured here, Brezhnev, who was more conservative and he valued stability. His policies would see the USSR enter a stable but stagnant era with slow economic growth. The USSR falls behind. But Brezhnev is not afraid to use the Soviet military to intervene in places like Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. And he increases military spending a lot. He establishes this thing called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which allows for communist nations to invade or use force to intervene in foreign communist nations if they saw communism as under threat. After Brezhnev dies, Andropov and Chernenko rule briefly, but they died too quickly to have any real effects. And then Gorbachev comes to power, and he thinks he can reform the USSR and save it. He has a policy called transparency and reform. Ironically, these reforms are based off of Czechoslovakia, which they had previously invaded under Brezhnev because of the reforms they made. Finally, we have federal Russia. When the Soviet states began rapidly declaring their independence, Russia kind of saw the writing on the wall, and a lot of Russian nationalists wanted an independent Russian state. So the USSR starts dissolving. There's a failed coup after Gorbachev resigns, and some hardline communists try to retake Russia and reestablish the USSR, but it doesn't work. With the Soviet Union dissolved, Yeltsin becomes the president of Russia. He introduces a lot of rapid reforms, including, shock therapy, which creates a massive unemployment and inflation and corruption. In 1993, the constitutional crisis occurs, and Yeltsin responds with force. He dissolves parliament to create a Russian state with more executive power. This new Russian state is oligarchical. Powerful people like the ultra-rich have sway in the government, but cracks in Yeltsin's leadership show, and Putin takes the reins of the Russian state. He uses his time as a KGB agent to consolidate power. Even further around the executive branch, he weakens the oligarchs. And of course, more recently, he has annexed Crimea from Ukraine. That was in 2014. And then in 2022, as we all know, he does an outright invasion of Ukraine. And this further alienates Russia from the West, and it brings them closer with China, while Western sanctions block trade and diplomatic relations with the West. So what are the conclusions and themes here? Well, Russia is really a story of despotism versus freedom. It's a nation that's so acquainted with authoritarianism, one must appreciate the endurance of the Russian people. They survived kings, czars, and presidents, almost all of which seem to have the natural inclination to repress them. It's also a story of isolation. Time and time again, Russia has found itself fighting for a place on the world stage, desperate for a place at the negotiation table. From Ivan IV to Yeltsin, rulers sought to be equal to or greater than their rivals, especially the West. The hardships the nation has endured have really made Russians a hard people. A lot of us in America think of them as unfriendly, even though that might not be accurate. Um, but again, they're no less capable of compassion and understanding. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about my friend Pavel. I really wanted to have an interview on this slide, but unfortunately, he's a bit busy. Um, it, he's a Russian Ukrainian. You know, he's ethnically Russian. His family speaks Russian at home, but he lives in Ukraine. He's seen the war firsthand, though he might not have been directly involved in it. He's not a soldier, thankfully, and thankfully he's safe. But I met him shortly before the war, and I remember when it broke out. Uh, I was so concerned. But he he's gone through it, um, and he's seen kind of Russian history firsthand. Um, and it's very interesting to me how the Russian invasion has changed his culture and society. For example, he no longer speaks Russian on the street with friends. That used to be something he would do. He lives in eastern Ukraine in Poltava, but now I've spoken to him. He says no one speaks Russian anymore. Um, it's just seen as unpatriotic. I can't help but feel some empathy for him, being kind of stuck between these two worlds as a Russian Ukrainian. And thank you for letting me share that. And that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you.